Hello, and welcome to today's presentation with Dr. Dima Ayoub. My name is Sean Swanek, and I'm the librarian for Middle East and Islamic Studies at Duke University. This is the third and final talk in an informal series I put together that brings together scholars and collections. I would be remiss if I did not thank our sponsors, the Duke Middle East Studies Center, the Duke Islamic Studies Center, and the Duke University Libraries. A special thanks to Griffin Orlando for organizing the finer details of this event and all DUMESC events. A bit of housekeeping. If you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand, lower right-hand corner, click on reactions, or insert your question into the chat, and Griffin or myself will read the question on your behalf. Digital humanities has been around for quite some time, and one could argue is regaining momentum in part because of the dramatic effects of the pandemic, which has forced all of us to communicate, research, and maintain our curiosities via the digital realm. Duke University Libraries is a delighted supporter and collaborator of such work and has indeed contributed to ensuring scholars have the tools and resources necessary to conduct such work. Locally, Professor Adam Mestian leads the Jara'id project, a database of all known Arabic script newspapers, now hosted by DUMESC, and 2 days ago presented with Dr. Catherine Schwartz about their current exploration of a Cairene Sheikh's personal collection of manuscripts and printed books. Down the road, with our friends at UNC, the recently graduated Matthew Lynch completed his PhD on Rumi's Mesnavi, where he extracted and analyzed the Quranic verses that are scattered throughout the Mesnavi. Today's presenter continues this trend of digital humanities and right-to-left scripts. Dr. Dima Ayoub, a graduate of McGill University, is currently CV Starr Junior Faculty Fellow in International Studies at Middlebury College with an emphasis on Starr. She has published on a wide variety of topics, but her passion remains translation and translation studies. Enamored with the development of Paratexts and the translation of Arabic literature, her current book-length project rewrites the modern literary history of Arabic literature through the lens of the Paratexts. A fascinating genre of literature, Paratexts have played an important, and one could argue divisive role in the history of translating from Arabic to English, and in some cases, as Dima in her most recent publication, Politics of Paratextuality, the glossary between translation and transnational English to Arabic. Today's presentation discussion will be about her foray into the stimulating world of digital humanities with a concentration on analyzing paratexts. We're very fortunate to have her here as this is a work in progress. Welcome to Duke Zoom, Dr. Ayoub. The floor, as it were, is all yours.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Thanks everyone for being here and to the Middle East Center for the invitation. To Ellen, Sean, and Griffin, thank you for making this happen. Before I delve into my talk, I'd like to invite everyone to look at the next 3 slides that I'm going to show, and I'll put them up here slowly so you have time to take a look. These slides contain translated Arabic terms in glossaries from 3 novels translated from Arabic. So just make a note about any differences you may notice. What I hope is obvious to all of you is how MashaAllah is explained in 3 completely different ways. In one case, you'll notice the religious overtones. In another, nationalist. It makes the term seem as though it is local only to Egypt. And in the other case, it relates to beauty and carries gendered overtones. So why are these differences significant? This is what we will be exploring today, how buried in glossaries, notes, and marginalia lie terms that actually reveal to us, when we pay attention to them, keys to understanding the westward movement of Arabic literature. I hope to convince you that in order to make sense of the shifting sands of East-West relationships, particularly the imperialist and colonial expectations that have undergirded cultural exchange for the last century and more, our focus must expand to include paratexts. So what exactly do I mean by paratexts? In the late 1980s, the French literary theorist Gerard Genette described paratext as encompassing all aspects of a text's accompanying material. This includes titles, subtitles, prefaces, forewords, afterwards, notes, glossaries, epigraphs, blurbs, book covers, even dust jackets, and many other kinds of what he called secondary signals. Genette draws particular attention to the role of paratexts as thresholds, boundary setters, and zones of transition and transaction. Since Genette, many scholars, particularly in translation studies, like Theo Hermans and Urpo Kovala, have tried to shift the focus from close reading of the text to consider external factors, primarily to show that a reading of a text never occurs in isolation from the paratext around it. And the argument here is that a reader never comes to a text, but always to a book. And the book is the product that circulates in a context, which also affects its reception. Following Genette, many scholars argue that paratexts, quote, ensure the text's presence in the world, end quote. So in other words, there is no text without paratexts. In my work, I examine how a dense network of translators, editors, and publishers use paratexts as codifying tools with multivalent functions in translations of Arabic literature. I focus on introductions, prefaces, forewords, afterwards, glossaries, notes, and footnotes. And in Arabic literary scholarship in particular, these have often been deemed as inconsequential, neutral tools that guide translation. But what I'm saying is that they carry out a major function in addressing readers' expectations. Employing a hybrid mode of analysis that combines close reading with digital tools, I look closely at the impact of paratexts on Western cultural understandings of the Arabic language and the Muslim world in the post-World War II imaginary. I'm particularly interested in grounding the relationship between paratexts and knowledge production about Arabic literary canonicity, gender relations, and the politics of translation. Using computational methods, I scale, track, and tease out where Western readership demands, expectations, and power lurk within the margins of a growing corpus of Arabic literature in translation. And the paratext, I argue, has materialized hand in hand with the development of Arabic literature in English translation. And these developments in turn have evolved in relationship to geopolitical events. The post-war period matters because it is when paratexts emerged as legible and uniform aspects of Arabic literature in English translation. I really want to emphasize here that it is not, what I'm saying is not that paratexts did not exist before. Of course, there's a long paratextual tradition in Arabic letters and religious texts, and their use, of course, in the period of the Nahda is very interesting and quite innovative. I'm thinking here, of course, of Tahtawi's extensive use of glossaries. And of course, more recently, Marwa Shakri's work on the translation of Darwin also makes quite a very compelling examination of the paratext. But for the first time, what I'm saying is that for the first time, we can see that these accoutrements become crucial to the project of domesticating and legitimating Arabic literature for English readers. Paratexts are interesting to me because I find in them both exploitative and liberatory aspects. And these are the two aspects I hope to be talking about today. Exploitative because paratexts sometimes perpetuate the idea that Arabic literature requires ethnographic decoding, that it can't be literature for literature's sake, but that it must be a window onto something. And here I want to draw on some of the comparative work that I've done in my book to look at sort of two different translations of a very, one of the most popular novels that was translated into English, the Yaqubian Building, and to look at some of the differences that sort of occur in the paratexts of both translations. So here's the glossary from the Spanish translation. So contains terms for food, names of famous personalities, not necessarily political ones. Religious terms are, of course, still included. And I want to, and this is a 3-page, as you can see, a 3-page glossary. The English glossary, on the other hand, is much more expansive. It has a lot more proper names. It stretches for 7 pages, includes, and I've highlighted the sort of the terms that the English glossary focuses on. So a lot of emphasis on the kind of political aspects of the Yaqubian Building. This kind of ethnographic approach has neo-Orientalist implications, and we have to be aware of how paratexts too may further Orientalist agendas. Scholars like Marilyn Booth call attention to the exploitative potential of paratexts in other contexts, looking, for example, at covers of books and what they depict. So putting pictures of veiled women on covers of novels that don't even discuss the veil or Islam. What do these types of choices reflect about reader expectations or publisher marketing tools? Paratextual framings like book covers are part of what Booth calls the global publicity apparatuses that seek to homogenize a discursive category of the silenced Arab and Muslim woman who, on the one hand, is rarely given space to represent herself, yet on the other is everywhere represented in the name of marketing Arabic literature. In The Politics of Translation, Spivak critiques neocolonial expectations of Western readers that turn fiction by third world writers into eyewitness accounts. The demand placed on these writers results in the denial of their rhetoricity or the aesthetic value of their art. The danger here is particularly acute when we translate the work of marginalized women writers, whose work tends to be valued solely for content rather than creative or artistic production. In the Euro-American horizon of expectations, writers from the Arab world seem always to act as anthropological native informants, faithfully representing and explaining local histories, politics, and societies to non-local, usually Western readers. Seen this way, the inclusion of glossaries, notes, or other forms of paratexts become one added obstacle, yet another discursive regulation with which Arab writers must comply. From an exploitative standpoint, the practice of writing or fiction for fiction's sake is not permitted for Arab writers, where paratexts serve to bolster their status as cultural ethnographers. But what I'm also interested in are the liberatory possibilities of paratexts. And here I draw on Beth McCoy's work on paratexts in the context of African-American freedom struggle writers, where she argues that paratextual elements have historically functioned, quote, centrally as a zone of transacting ever-changing modes of white domination and of resistance to that domination, end quote. So one example I'll give here is the groundbreaking work of feminist activist translators who have for decades challenged the male-centered canon of Arabic literature by insisting on translating women writers and writing extensively about this in their paratexts. But even more than that, I'm thinking of the ways that scholar and translator Marilyn Booth and others, of course, who worked in the 1980s and 90s at a time when human rights discourses were exploiting the issue of female genital mutilation, overplaying Arab and Muslim women's oppression. During this time, translators like Booth and others insisted on translating works by Arab women authors that presented gender in a more complex way. Booth's introductions, her translators' notes, of which there are many, and scholarship on women writers offered an on-ramp for Western readers to hold more than one narrative about women in the Arab world. Don't forget also that this was a moment when publishers were otherwise tripping over themselves to publish every word that Nawal al-Saadawi wrote. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with Nawal al-Saadawi, it's an Egyptian woman writer and a medical doctor whose success in the West positioned her to be the sole representation of Arab women. And I'm happy to talk more about this during the Q&A. Paratexts can also be sites where the translator is freed from the author. And in the case of Egyptian author Ahmed Naji, the translator was instrumental in freeing the author from an actual prison. So in Ahmed Naji's Using Life, or Istikhdam al-Hayat, a novel which was described as, quote, harming public morals and charged for public indecency, because Naji used sexually obscene language. This resulted in the author being referred to a criminal court in Cairo. And as the translator writes in the translator's note, there was nothing remarkable about the obscenities in Using Life, and language far more explicit has appeared often in both contemporary and classical Arabic literature. Ahmed Naji was sentenced to 2 years in prison, marking this as the first time in modern Egypt that an author has been jailed for a work of fiction. At the time the novel was published in English, Ahmed Naji was still awaiting retrial and was under a travel ban. The translator explains Naji's predicament in the translator's notes, and I would position this paratext alongside other advocacy campaigns by the International Association of Writers, PEN, and the international uproar to free Ahmed Naji on all social media channels. Eventually, he was released from prison, and there was quite a campaign with different hashtags. Let me switch gears here a bit to talk about glossaries. And what I want to emphasize here is not that the mere presence of glossaries is what is interesting, but their persistence as literary artifacts, and then also the recurrences of certain words within them. In a way, the consistency with which glossaries are included have come to form something of an expectation on the part of the English language readers, where habits of reading and entitlement to explanation have combined to cement the glossary as a literary fixture of translated Arabic novels. And again, I'd be happy to come back to some of these, but I put here Sahar Khalifa's, the glossary in Sahar Khalifa's book, and just to sort of show some of the subtle ways, perhaps, that the translators use the space of the glossary to make certain political interventions. So here we have an entry on shakshuka, which, as we all know, has been co-opted into Israeli cuisine. And here we see the translator insisting that this is a North African dish, for example. This is another example of the kind of persistence of glossaries that I'm referring to. This is a 1989 translation of Moroccan writer Layla Abu Zaid. And we see here, this is an example of a text with extensive use of paratext. So there's introduction and glossary, a preface, maps. But what I want to draw your attention to is the way that in the 20 years after the original date of publication, there was a new revised edition of this novel. And we see that the same, and I'll come back to some of this, we see that the same terms that were included in the 1989 edition have been transported completely without any change. There are other changes, of course. We see that there was a new revised edition, introduction to the revised edition by Barbara Harlow to mark the kind of 20-year anniversary, sort of reflecting on the University of Texas at Austin, University Press, the sort of the importance of UT Austin in, of course, promoting Arabic literature and translation. While the number of translations has increased in recent years, interest in Arabic literature is still the result of ongoing conflicts in the Middle East, which can in no way be disassociated from US foreign policies there since World War II. The Cold War also created an interest in Arabic literature that was not exactly, how should we put it, literary, but having more to do with the need to translate for the purposes of stronger foreign policy. This is another angle of my work that I won't get into here, but with the growth of Arabic literary studies, there's an expansion of publishers, both trade presses and university presses, big and small, with special series devoted to the Middle East. Let me put the slide here. So this is the University of Arkansas, their website. This is part of the King Fahd Center, which was established in the 1990s. This is part of a $23 million endowment that the Saudi government gave the university during Clinton's presidency, and it helped establish a Center for Middle East Studies, but also dedicated a series to translated Arabic literature. And of course, many of you know that University of Arkansas Press has been also quite active in translating Arabic literature. Beyond and often in conjunction with the growth of area studies, geopolitical events like the Iranian Revolution and the hostage crisis, the 1990 Iraq War, and of course 9/11 were decisive. Each of these individual events constituted historical turning points. I could give an entire talk on each of these events, each galvanizing what some would call a boom in translated literature. In an interview with one of the translators that I've interviewed, they revealed to me that a certain publisher delayed publishing his translation because the publisher sensed that Iraq was going to invade Kuwait. Let me turn now to the digital aspects of my work. As I'm sure a lot of you here are wondering what the digital humanities has to do with any of this. Let me say off the bat that none of the work I have done on Paratexts would have been possible without digital methods. And of course, I want to acknowledge here the help of my wonderful students, which also none of this work would have been possible without. In order to analyze how paratexts function as a habit of Arabic literary translation, one that touches on questions of gender, location, networks, word patterns, styles, genres, and time periods, I have had to create and rely on a large data set. When I started doing this kind of work, I was still a PhD student at McGill, and I started a very small data set of 30 of 30 entries, and now that data set has expanded to more than 1,000 entries. Of course, I still rely on close reading methods, but have found this to be limited at times, as it is otherwise difficult to track how widely present paratexts are in Arabic literature. So I use a mix of quantitative and textual analysis that combines close reading and distant reading. So this is some of the, this is the kind of back end of my data sets. And these are the kinds of things that I track. So this graph shows that based on just the 450 titles that I included in this particular data set, there are significantly more male authors than female authors. But it also shows that while there are more male translators than female translators, the gender breakdown is more proportionate than for authors. One of the claims that my research debunks about the increased visibility of Arab women writers in translations is that publishers tend to privilege or to want more texts or translate more texts by women authors. And this is simply not true. This is a claim, of course, that circulates quite widely by writers, critics, translators of Arabic literature. My data indicates otherwise. The expanding interest in depictions of Arab women's literature does not correspond to an actual increase in the translation of text by women authors. Indeed, if we notice an increase in the translation of women authors from the Arab world, it is perhaps because their visibility is enhanced against the backdrop of an inherently male canon. Here we have a graph that shows that there are more than double the number of titles whose author and translator were of the same gender. So this is a kind of speculation that I had always had, that the gender of the author and translator tends to align. And yes, it's true. This is a graph that shows male authors are overrepresented in every paratext category by percentage. And these are just some fun word clouds that were created in Voyant. And this is the kind of work that's more concerned with tracking and assessing the extent that certain themes and concepts recur in glossaries across the last 7 decades. So words relating to clothing, religion, customs, political figures, and food are the most common recurrences. I've also discovered glossaries to be crucial sites of linguistic playfulness, of bilingualism, and even at times an extension of the narrative itself. And I'm going to show a few examples of a glossary here that sort of represents the kind of its multivocal function. And I turn here to an interesting case, Hadaf Sowaef's novel, 1999 novel, The Map of Love, which was originally written in English and is an example of a work that relies heavily on the mechanism of the glossary. It's one of the few English language texts that include an extensive 200-term glossary that spans 20 pages. In both its size and scope, the glossary in The Map of Love is an unusual document. It raises questions also about whether Arabic or English here is the source language. It also brings up the idea that even within literary texts, borders are positioned to exclude seemingly peripheral material. The glossary serves as a crucial lexical companion for the novel's non-Arabic speaking readers. But I also think that its function is yoked to different expectations and pressures of readability, a function that extends far beyond its purpose as a lexical companion. I read the glossary in The Map of Love as an extension of Sowaef's authorial voice, one that is hyper aware of the power relations between Arabic and English. On the one hand, Soaif repurposes the glossary for its linguistic function to accommodate and support the Arabic-infused English of the novel. On the other hand, she uses the glossary as an apparatus of political intervention. And having talked to her about this glossary, it was a sort of, how do I put it? The publisher had insisted that she include one. And so this was a kind of her way of kind of responding to that demand. Significantly, Soaif's glossary includes over 25 terms and expressions that contain the word Allah. These, for the most part, attempt to avoid a straightforward explanation that relies on English equivalents and work to capture the varied ways such terms are used in both religious and non-religious contexts. For example, in explaining the expression La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah, Soaif writes, "There's no power or strength but with the support of God, said when matters go beyond what you can help. It is a kind of, I'm absolved of responsibility in this, an expression of helpless sadness as one watches matters get out of hand. Also of exasperation as an opponent refuses to see sense." Very useful. The commentary on the expression, mashallah, sorry, no arrow there, but it's right here, follows a similar pattern as some of the entries I showed earlier, but also follows in the way that Soaif here in particular tries to intervene. It reads, literally, look what God has willed, used to express admiration without being thought envious or activating the evil eye. End quote. Without an emphasis on the religious usages, Soaif's explanations include the superstitious element for a fuller understanding of these expressions. Translators of Arabic often talk about the challenges of whether to domesticate or foreignize terms like Allah. The choice to activate domesticating tactics by translating Allah as God is tied to the present politics of cultural transmission and understanding, or lack of it, as Marilyn Booth writes. So translating Allah as God is a way of reminding readers that we are all talking about what we assume is the same monotheistic deity. By leaving the word Allah untranslated or foreignized, there's also room to challenge how Western media effectively isolates and others the term as a quintessentially Muslim word used to refer to God. On some level, Soaif's compulsion to gloss, overgloss perhaps, certain terms, functions to counteract misconceptions of the Arabic language as a controversial language, as an inaccessible language, as a language that's impervious to change. So I'll conclude here. Glossaries and paratexts are imprints of what the English reader is assumed to not understand. They are not neutral sites, but instead are warehouses of foreignness where indifference is reified by their presence in the first place. And in the case of glossaries, the compulsion to keep the words foreignized and the compulsion, of course, to repeat words and the same words over decades. To a certain extent, glossaries indicate the limitations of the English language as much as they speak to the challenges of translating Arabic. What I hope my work opens up is a consideration of paratexts as liminal spaces between accessibility and translatability on the one hand, and untranslatability on the other. They represent a crucial site of translational struggle, in which the impossibility and necessity of translation collide in the interpretive work of textual translation. Standing back a bit then, I'm asking us to think of paratexts both as a technology wielded by a complex mediating network that produces literary effect, and on the other hand, a technology that functions processually alongside translation beyond the assistive role it usually plays. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ayoub. We have a bit of time. If anyone in the audience has some questions they would like to ask,